Hi everybody, this is Robert Perry, your instructor, MiraCosta College, Political Science 102, Summer 2020. So let's talk a little bit about Chapter 2, alright? So, this is our structure. We had elites at the top, then, the merchants, bankers, lawyers, farmers, fishermen, then we start to see indentured servants and slaves at the very bottom. We mentioned in week one, part one, that there's something called a social contract here. And, a lot of philosophers have different views on how the social contract should be set forth and kind of the natural inclination that people have. They speak a lot of something called the state of nature. The state of nature is the state that we're in when there's no corrupting factors that might cause us to be selfish or violent or whatever. So, uh, Thomas Hobbes had written a novel called Leviathan, and in there, the state of nature people lived in was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And in a sense, you needed a strong, a kind of an authoritarian government to keep society together. Um, we talked a little bit about Locke in the last one. In the last class, remember the Locke says in our state of nature, we're morally bound to not harm each other in their lives or possessions, but without government to defend them against them, uh, those seeking to hurt them. So people would have no security in their rights, and people would live in fear of an attack or invasion if we did not have government. Locke continued to argue that individuals would agree to form a state or a nation. You know what I mean? In this definition of state, we're talking about a government that would provide a neutral judge acting to protect the lives, liberty, and property of those who live within it. And that's a lot like what we have in the United States now, where we have a judiciary that's independent of the other two branches of government. All right. So here's a little bit of belief of what the founders thought within protecting liberty and property. Um, Equality meant equality under the law, not and equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality in wealth, intelligence, virtue, or talent. That is something that might come up periodically in this class, where we have equality of opportunity. Do we need equality of outcome, whether it's through redistribution of the wealth or whatever? So, the Republican form of government was the ultimate goal. The representatives would be responsible, non-hereditary, didn't want an aristocracy or mass democracy. He expected the masses to consent to government by men of principle and property, and generally that we would have an indirect role in selecting decision makers. At this time, when we see the Constitution put into place, the only thing that the citizens could directly vote for would be their representatives, and we'll talk more about that as we go along here in class. Also believed in limited government. Founders believed that in a limited government that a small government couldn't threaten liberty or property. And we needed to divide government into separate bodies capable of checking one another. We'll talk more about that. So, in the concept of developing the representation part of the Constitution, there were originally two plans offered. The first one was Virginia Plan. The Virginia plan sought a two-house legislature, lower house to be chosen by the citizens of the states, and the upper house chosen by the lower house. Congress would have the authority to nullify state laws. This proposed a parliamentary form of government, and Congress would choose executive and judiciary branches. Okay, right away, this is very comparable to the English Parliament, right? So think about that. The New Jersey plan was a little bit different. Had a one-house legislature, one vote per state, um, separate executive and judiciaries, and expand power of Congress to include the right to tax and regulate commerce. And that's a very important last point. Now the United States government is finding a way to generate revenue. Okay, so couldn't come to a consensus on those two proposals, so we had something called the Connecticut Compromise, where the state of Connecticut proposed a two-house legislature, which was with the lower house based on population, the upper would be equal, 2 senators per state. So that first part develops the House of Representatives, where the census is this year. Every 10 years, there's a census that determines representation in Congress. Um, but the Senate is always going to be 2 per state. So California will have 2 senators. Rhode Island, which is one of the smallest states, will have 2 senators as well. So equal representation. Now, slavery was addressed in the Constitution as well through the 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of slaves of each state would be counted for the purpose of representation and apportioning direct taxes. Congress prohibited slave trade, but not before 1808. And Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution guaranteed that escaped slaves would be returned. Now, the states under the Articles were interfering with the development of our national economy, so some Southern planners feared that Congress may impose export taxes. So what the compromise was that articles exported from any state should bear no tax or duty. So if we take something in from Arizona, we shouldn't have to pay a tariff or a tax or a duty on that. In Arizona wouldn't be charged a tariff for shipping something into California. Only imports could be taxed by the national government. This protected U.S. interests against foreign goods. Also, voter qualification. Obviously, the elites didn't want the masses voting. So mass voting participation was not favored by delegates, right? You want to put the hands of the vote into people that you might be able to trust a little bit more, and I don't think they necessarily trusted the masses during this time. Delegates returned the question of suffrage to the state legislatures, and right now, the states are the ones that run the elections. The only thing that the United States has a Federal Election Commission, which makes election laws, but the only other criteria that is given for voting is in the United States is you have to be 18 years of old and a U.S. citizen. Now, states can reject or kind of maybe take away a person's right to vote with regards to maybe a disqualifying felony or a prison stint or whatever. But yeah, that's not done at the federal level. That's done at the state level. And obviously, women were not given the right to vote, and they didn't get the right to vote until about 100 years from now, back in history. Congress also wanted to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Again, all of these are used to generate revenue for the government. In Article 6 of that Constitution, had committed that the U.S. would pay off all bonds that were out there, and taxing power guaranteed that commitment would be fulfilled. Money and credit was also protected. Article 1, Section 8 enables Congress to protect money and property. Make bankruptcy laws. So if you ever have to declare bankruptcy, all your debts are forgiven if a federal judge approves it. The regulation of coining money and the value of money. Having a fixed state standards of weights and measures. That basically means that if we have a pound of sugar here in in California, if we send that to Massachusetts, it still should be a pound. It can't be a pound and a half. I don't know if you kind of get where I'm going with that. Punishing counterfeiting, establishing post office, and also passing copyright and patent laws. So if you ever watch, I like to watch UFC a lot, and they right before the card starts, they put up a note saying that reproduction and reuse of that fight card violates copyright laws, and you can be prosecuted. So yeah, we have copyright and patent. Patents are intellectual properties that people create, and if you have an idea or some type of invention, you could have put a patent on it, and it's yours. We also started moving out west. However, there was one problem. You're moving into areas that people already lived. You're taking people's lands away. So Just kind of, one of the things that happened in history that maybe we're not too proud of. Um, Article 1, Section 8, and Article 2 of the provisions centralize the diplomatic and military affairs. So, states can't enter into treaties, maintaining ships of war, or engaging in war unless invaded. Strong navy was essential to protect commerce. There was trading going on, and piracy was a real danger. A national army and navy were not so much protection against invasion as much as protection and promotion of the government's commercial and territorial ambitions. So, just having the impression of having a strong military is just as good as having one. We also have protection against revolutions, protection against domestic insurrection. Article 6 basically establishes a supremacy clause. Article 6 says laws of Congress supersede laws of the state, made it certain Congress would control interstate commerce, bankruptcy, monetary affairs, transportation, communication, and military affairs. What does this all mean? So, we have federal laws, we have state laws, and sometimes we have local ordinances. Ordinances are done by cities and counties that, can give that put laws out there. A lot of the ones we know are parking ordinances or noise ordinances, but at the state and federal level, it gets a little bit more complicated. So we have federal laws, and a federal law is always going to be trumping state law. All right, so federal law will trump state law, meaning that if there's a federal law in place and there's a state law that conflicts with it, the federal law will take would supersede laws of the state. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, so let's talk about this real quick. In California, marijuana is legal for recreational purposes and medicinal use. Now, at the federal level, marijuana is still a Schedule 1 narcotic, meaning that if a federal agent catches you with marijuana, they could arrest you. If a federal agency wanted to go into the dispensaries in California and shut them down and arrest the owners and charge them with cultivation or with intent to distribute, they could potentially do that. Now, is that going to happen? I don't think so. The Obama administration had originally took in the position that if we had a state that passed these laws, these recreational use laws, and these medicinal use laws, if they passed it as a citizen vote, they would not go into those states and shut the marijuana dispensaries down. The Trump administration had originally said they were going to crack down on this and start shutting them, but they really never did once Jeff Sessions resigned from Congress. Or resigned from Trump's cabinet, sorry. The people, when we see republicanism in operation, the people elected only the House members to 2-year terms. State legislatures elected U.S. senators to 6-year terms. Electors selected as state legislatures chose to select the president. Federal judges were to be appointed by the president for life. And we'll talk more about that last one. Now let's talk about the concept of separation of powers and checks and balances. In Federalist 51, Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. So this separation of powers doctrine was a safeguard against, majoritarianism, and also protected the elites' liberty and property and prevented something called tyranny of the majority. So, say for instance, there is a law that the majority of the state or the majority of the citizens want, right? So, say we want to. Okay, so let's use this example. In California, we'll talk about this when we get to direct democracy. A few years ago, there was a proposition, Prop 8, that sought to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman. It was passed here in California with 54% of the vote. And we'll get into this discussion a little bit more when we get to talking about the courts. But what the government found through the courts was that this law was violating the rights of the minority, those people in the 49% and below category, right? So tyranny of the majority was affecting the minority's rights. So the easiest way to look at this is that we have majority rule, but as long as we don't violate the rights of the minority, majority can rule. But again, I really want to emphasize this: you can't violate the rights of the minority. And there's a quote: "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal control and government would be necessary." Also, kind of concept of judicial review. And when we get to the Supreme Court, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Marbury versus Madison gave the Supreme Court the right to invalidate state laws and constitution, but also any laws of Congress that conflict with the Constitution. So Marbury versus Madison simply gave they gave themselves the right to judicial review. Talk about factions. The Constitution was originally ratified. The Bill of Rights is an afterthought. The Bill of Rights was passed in 1791, penned by Madison. Response to calls from several states for greater constitutional protections for individuals' liberty. And the Bill of Rights is used to protect the people from the government. So if you look at the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, Nine, 10, those all protect the people from the government. If you click on this, it'll show you the Bill of Rights. We'll talk more about that probably on the Wednesday class. California has its own constitution, which we'll talk about. It's been amended 480 times compared to the U.S. Constitution. It's been only amended 27. So checks and balances. Remember, we just talked about that. So some examples. Here are some examples of executive checks. I want you to read along with this. The president can check laws passed by Congress. They can appoint federal judges, but that has to be confirmed by the Senate. And they can also issue executive orders to implement policy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The legislative branch can override a president's veto, but you need 2/3 of Congress to agree to that, and good luck with that. Congress can barely agree with a simple majority. Imagine a 66% vote as opposed to 51% vote in Congress. They approve presidential appointments. Only the Senate does that. They can impeach federal officers, including the president, which we saw earlier this year. And they could check the judicial branch by proposing a constitutional amendment. So if there's a law that Congress passes and that the judicial branch determines it to be unconstitutional, the one way to make it constitutional is to propose a constitutional amendment. But that is very, very difficult, as you need not only 2/3 of Congress to pass it, you also need 3/4 of the state legislatures to pass it. So each state has a legislature in it, which has, members that vote for state issues. Out of 50, you would need 38 states to agree to ratify a constitutional amendment. Now, the judicial branch of the courts, they can rule decisions by the legislative branch and the executive branch unconstitutional. Remember, they gave themselves the concept of judicial review through Marbury versus Madison. And in my opinion, this is the greatest power. But one thing I want you guys to understand is that the only way to check decisions made by the court is through a constitutional amendment, and that's very, very difficult. So here's the criteria. Article 5 of the Constitution, 2/3 have to be a vote in favor. And then you need 3/4 of state legislatures. And we could see you need about 74% consensus, and that is a very hard thing to do. Okay, so we will talk about direct democracy in the next video, and we'll talk to you soon.